what's up?
Oh, nothing. Just on Twitter. #6fan. #in Iowa.
Oh, I heard about that contest. #6fan. #in Iowa. You and I could win 100K. #free money. That would be awesome.
#duh. #tuition. #books. #J's. #J's on my feet.
Win that 10K though, you gotta be at the games. #UNI Women's Basketball. #UNI Men's Basketball. There's 4 games left. The more you're there, the more your name goes in. #6fan. #in Iowa.
#I'm there. #all of them. #better chance. #4 is better than 1. #duh. I'll be there. #Ben Jacobson. Hey Pat, did you hear about the top 100 sexiest male coaches?
No, I didn't. #inform me. I don't know. #6fan.
#Ben Jacobson. #sexy. I guess. #yes. Check those eyes. Ooh.
Speaking of basketball games, did you hear about the women's team, huh? Beating Wichita. #upset. number 24. #6fan. #in Iowa.
What a shocker. Were you there? Coach Warren. Nelson.
What's his hair color? #silver. #gray.
Did Jody.
#6fan. #in Iowa. In order for a student to win though, we gotta win as a team. And we're losing. #Pan American. Who are they?
#in Iowa. #6fan. Are they in Texas? Oklahoma. New York.
Now we need you guys' votes. Y'all kids are on your phones anyway, huh? #retweet. #6fan. #in Iowa.
How old are you? Are you a student? Dad. Mom. So to get this money, $100,000, folks.
#whoa.
We gotta vote. Vote all the time. Vote now. Vote later.
#Twitter. #Facebook. #6fan. #in Iowa.
NCAA website. Vote there too.
#6fan. #in Iowa.
Vote. Vote now. Vote later. Retweet. Favorites. Don't favorite. That's not a vote. Just retweet.
Twitter.
Alright, last time folks. You don't get the 10K for going to the games unless we win the $100,000. So vote now. Literally right now.
#go. #vote. #retweet. #6fan. #in Iowa.
You're not doing anything anyways. You're on your computer. Phones. Retweet.
#vote. #retweet.